Alright, sorry for the interruption in the video there. My computer ran out of space, and so picking right back up where we left off, we had been talking about if culture determines morality, then then if you grow up in a culture, the culture of the KKK, or if you grow up in a culture of rapists, or if you grow up in a culture where you're taught to despise homosexuals and atheists, then it's morally right for you to do those things. If culture determines morality, then whatever culture you grew up in, whatever they tell you to do, whatever they teach you to do, then that's morally right. And so then it would have been correct for those individuals who flew the planes into the towers, because that's the culture they grew up in. It was right for them to do it. And then also with Rwanda and the killing fields, it was right for them to do, because that's the culture that they grew up in. If culture determines morality, then it's okay for people to do those kinds of things. If someone wants to declare that some actions that are, if someone wants to declare that some actions of these cultures are in fact wrong, then they have to commit to the idea that there's more to morality than just the culture that you grew up in. And so if you think that it's wrong for the individuals who flew the planes into the towers to do what they did, if you think it's wrong for the people in Rwanda to have committed that kind of, to have killed all of those individuals, if you think those things are morally wrong, then you have to come to the position of saying it's more than just culture. There has to be something else. It has to be something other than culture that determines morally right and wrong things. Now, many people, myself included, when I first started trying to understand all of these things and to develop my own ideas, as I was starting to change my mind, I didn't like that idea. I didn't like the idea of having to tell people that what they were doing, not that what they were doing was wrong, but I didn't like the idea of somebody telling other people that their ideas were wrong, right? And so I didn't like the idea of that I might have to approach someone and say, no, what you think is incorrect. That was very off-putting for me, because I didn't believe that there was any absolute truth. I didn't believe that some things were true for all people. And so I would have made the claim, I would have made the truth claim, that there's no such thing as truth. Now, if I had made that claim, in fact, as I was making that claim to some individuals, one of those individuals asked me a very simple question. They said, "You say there's no truth. Is that truth claim true?" Right? Now think about it for just a moment. That truth claim is just the idea of making a claim of truth. The claim that I was making, the truth claim that I was making was, there is no truth. Well, think about it for a second. If there is no truth, then the claim that there is no truth is not true. It can't be true. Why not? Because the very claim itself declares that there is no truth. So, since there is no such thing as truth, there is no truth, then the truth claim that there is no truth is true. It can't possibly be true. That can't possibly be right. Instead of being self-evident, like the law of non-contradiction, it's self-refuting. It's self-refuting. It argues against itself. If the claim is made, there is no truth, and if that statement is true, then it can't possibly be right. It can't possibly be right, because if there's no truth, then you can't say there's no truth, because that's a claim on truth. And so there are different variations of this particular idea. I've heard there's no absolute truth. Well, if you ask somebody if that's absolutely true, I mean, right away, again, that same principle of self-defeat is part of the problem. If there's no absolute true, are you absolutely sure that that's true? Well, it can't be absolutely true, because if you're declaring that there is no absolute truth, then that very statement can't be absolutely true. And so then, there must be some things, again, there that's absolutely true. Or somebody might say, you can't know truth. Well, if you can't know truth, how do you know that? Because if it's true that you can't know truth, then you can't know that you can't know truth. if it's true that you can't know truth, then you can't possibly know the truth of the fact of that you can't know truth, which again is self-defeating. This one's slightly more trickier. Truth changes. Now, if truth changes over time or over cultures and those kinds of things, if it truly changes, then if someone makes the declaration that truth changes, that, and I'm going to say now, all truth changes, or even doesn't matter, you can do just truth changes. But if they make that statement, and since that statement is a claim on truth, that truth changes, that's a truth claim, then that truth changes, could change, and then truth wouldn't change anymore. Then it would be true that truth doesn't change, right? Because if it's true that all truth changes, and if that thing is true, then that truth could change. Since all truths can change, that truth can change. And if it changed, then it would be true that truth doesn't change anymore, right? And so let me know when that happens, when that change takes place, and then we won't have to worry about that truth changes anymore, because now truth won't change. It will be just true. Any and all of these things, all of these different statements, they're going to be self-contradictory. They're going to face that kind of illogical position where they're going to struggle against themselves, and they're going to defeat themselves in what they're saying. So some slightly less difficult sayings that you can see are self-defeating. If someone says to you, "I don't speak a word of English," well, that's self-contradictory. Obviously they do, because they just said, "I don't speak a word of English." What if somebody said, "My parents have no living children"? Well, you're standing there talking to them, so unless unless you're talking to a spirit of some sort, your parent has a living child. Here you are. You're standing right there in front of them. That's self-contradictory. It's self-defeating, right? And those other statements, they face that same kind of difficulty. And so when it comes to the idea that culture determines morality, here's what you're faced with this cultural relativism position that I was faced with. And when I was finally realized the difficulty that I had placed myself in with that foundational belief, that's when I began to say, I'm not sure that's right. I'm not sure that it's true that culture determines morality, because if it is, then all of these cultures that have ever existed have always been right. And in fact, that holds true, say, for American culture, for example. And for any number of the individuals who are expressing that the slavery that America was part of, if you're expressing that that was somehow wrong, that it was wrong for Americans to hold slaves, then you can't believe that culture determines morality, because if you did believe that culture determined morality, you'd have no problem with those individuals holding slaves. If you think that culture doesn't determine morality, then you can object to it. But if you think that it does, you can't object to Americans owning slaves back in the 1700s, because it was part of their culture, and so you can't say that it was wrong. The Aztecs, with all of the human sacrifice, you can't say that what they were doing was wrong, because it was part of their culture. You can't say, I had another example I lost. The Assyrians, if you ever study the ancient Assyrians, they were particularly vicious individuals, but you can't tell them they were wrong, because that particular level of viciousness in combat and post-combat, that was part of their culture. And if you think culture determines morality, it wasn't wrong for them to do those things. It was simply part of their culture. Now, that's a very, very difficult thing for a lot of people to engage in. Again, there are many, many things that are culturally, morally right and wrong based on the fact that the culture does it this way. And I think that's true, and I think that's fine and acceptable. But just because some things are culturally, morally relative, it does not mean that all things are culturally, morally relative. And so if there are some that are culturally not morally relative, then what does determine? If culture doesn't determine morality, what does determine morality? If culture isn't a foundation for morals, then what is the foundation for morality? What is the foundation for morals? If it isn't culture, what could it possibly be? Well, there are different ideas, and we'll discuss some of those as we get a little bit more into this worldviews, and as we look a little bit more at some of the moral engines. We'll start talking about some of those potential foundations and why they may work, why they may not work, right? So we'll be looking at those things. One more thing I wanted to discuss here quickly when it comes to this idea of moral relativism, the idea that culture does determine morality. If that were true, again, we could never speak then of moral progress. We could only speak of moral change. If culture is the foundation for moral rights and wrongs, then you can't talk about things getting better or worse, because it really is only different. So if this culture over here and what they do is right for them, then it's not a better or worse moral culture. It's simply their moral culture. And if this group over here does the opposite, then it's not really better or worse. It's just different from this culture. And so what you've got there then are really just two cultures that are acting differently, but one of them isn't better than the other. They're just different. And so if you've got one that does in fact condone slavery, and that say this culture embraces slavery, it's part of their cultural norm, and then they consider it to be right, and this one doesn't, neither of them are better cultures. They're just a different culture. And if this culture over here one day decides that slavery is wrong and they get rid of it, well, that's not better. It's just different, because the culture determines whether it's right or wrong. So it's not a better culture. It's just a different culture. And if this one then adopts slavery, it's not a better culture or a worse culture. It's just different. Now they have a different cultural perspective, and they've adopted slavery, and well, that's fine. So if it's true that culture determines morality, we can't talk of moral progress, because there is no progress. If it's just up to that culture, then there is no goal. There's no better. It's like in the game of football. You have a goal, and it's over here, that end zone, and you're trying to get the ball into that end zone to score. And that's where you want to be, and that's the direction you should go. But if culture determines morality, whether you go this way or that way or whichever direction you go, it makes no difference whatsoever, because there's no goal. The goal is wherever your culture takes it or says it is or wants it to be. And so there is no progress. There is no getting better, because there's no such thing as better. There's just this culture or that culture. So all right. So in this lecture too, we had talked about, in the last lecture, we talked about that iceberg and how the iceberg, that humans are icebergs, and what you believe on a foundational level determines how you behave. And so as we talked about those worldviews, and now hopefully as we bring into our worldviews these ideas of logic, that law of non-contradiction, two opposing beliefs can't both at the same time be true, right? We talk some here about culture. Can culture be a foundation? Well, imagine a culture whose that foundation of their iceberg that determines their actions was based on the fact of whatever we say is right is right. That's going to be that morally relativistic position that's going to be particularly difficult for some people to endure, right? It was for me. I looked at it and I said, that can't be right. It can't be true that what they were doing there in Rwanda was the right thing to do. That doesn't make moral sense. Yeah. So in all of this, again, let me just say, it was a challenge for me. It was tough. I finally did change my mind, but it was only through a great deal of struggle and over a great deal of time. Now, if you feel like that you want to change your mind, certainly you can. You don't have to. Again, that's not why this class, it's not what the class is designed for, but it's designed to think. So if you think that somehow culture does determine all morals, all moral truths, then struggle with some of what I've said. Try to figure out how, if it's possible, how could it be that, yes, they do in fact hold moral truths that cultures do. You're free to explore definitely those possibilities. It's difficult to change your mind. I certainly wish you luck. If you have any questions, make sure that you contact me with those questions so that we can have some type of discussion about some of the things that I've said. If you have questions or if you have concerns, or hey, you didn't talk about this, what about these things over here? Absolutely, make contact with me, and we'll have that discussion as best we can. Again, you don't have to change your mind, but I want you to think about why you believe what you believe. Do you believe it because someone in authority told you? Because your parents told you that? Because your culture told you that? Because you read it in a book somewhere? Why is it that you believe what you believe? And then examining those beliefs and reflecting on them, trying to see if what you think actually holds up logically, and then also if it can hold up uh, under the experiences that you have had as well. So, with this lecture, begin reflecting on yourself, begin reflecting on that worldview like we talked about last time. Think about it through the lens of the law of non-contradiction. Think about it through some of the culture and just kind of see where you're at, and definitely communicate with me if you have any questions. And we'll see you next time.